Catch more fish, trout and rivers, part 3, presentation. Mending is essential to fly fishing. Every angler has their own mending style, mending preference. However, I've started to notice that a lot of anglers are automatically mending after their cast. I think this is a habit picked up when nymph fishing under an indicator, that automatic upstream mend. But if you're trying to fish a dry fly, mending right away will ruin your drift. There are a lot of good anglers who cast well and cast far, but the great ones understand how to mend. And if you find yourself mending too much, then it's time to introduce some new casts. This is just a short list. There are many more casts every angler should learn, but if you practice these, you should notice a difference right away. The first alternative cast I learned was a reach cast. You can do this upstream, downstream, fishing parallel, or at an angle. I was even using the reach cast, fishing for sea bass in Yokohama Bay in Tokyo. We would come alongside a tanker ship, and the boat we were fishing from wasn't able to get directly parallel to the ship. So I'd execute my cast and use a reach to make sure my retrieve spent the most time alongside the hull of the tanker we were fishing against. When you're fishing a dry fly, the drop cast is extremely useful. It helps the fly land in the water naturally, and it takes some of the guesswork out of wondering if your leader is in a pile or straight. When you execute the drop well, you also put a little slack in your leader and line, and that will help the initial drift. So I use a drop cast often. A drop cast is when, at the end of your cast as the line is straightening out, you abruptly stop the rod, allowing the fly and leader to get ahead of the fly line, so it hits the water first. A wiggle cast is designed to put slack in the line, and this will also help you with the initial drift, and you can make just one mend and have a pretty decent drift. And over the shoulder is when you're pointing your body downstream or facing the opposite side and finishing your cast on the back cast, allowing you to see exactly where your loop is to prevent you from snagging a tree or brush that you would otherwise hit if you're casting over your dominant shoulder. This will allow you to reach more of the river and gives your fly a little bit different drift. Flicking the fly or dabbing the fly is also a very useful method, one where you don't have much fly line out from the tip of your fly rod, and you can just use your wrist to present. The honorable mentions were the sidearm, which is useful during windy days or when you need to get under something, a water load that can help you straighten things out, and a roll cast. Roll cast is useful when nymphing, but I execute a little roll to kind of reset and start my traditional cast. You can combine any of these. You could do a over the shoulder wiggle with a drop, or you could do a reach and a drop, reach and a wiggle. All of these different presentations will help you avoid mending too much. To get a proper presentation, you need to be able to track your fly, and this is specifically for dry fly fishing. I think if you're indicator fishing, you'd be tracking the indicator, or if you're tight lining, you'd be looking at your sighter and understanding the angle that the line is penetrating the water. But in case of dry flies, I was surprised to see how infrequently anglers dress their flies. A dressed fly will have the best presentation, so I like to dress my fly at each likely looking spot. I was also surprised to see how short anglers let their tippet get. If my tippet is less than 1.5 feet, I'm usually tying on a new 2.5 foot piece. A short tippet will dramatically influence the drift of a fly. My next piece of advice is to not automatically recast if you see your fly submerged. Every time I go out, I seem to catch 1 or 2 fish on a submerged dry, especially a CDC caddis pattern. And finally, finishing the drift almost all the way until the fly is a few feet from you will greatly improve your chances of hooking up. Trout are tracking flies too, and they can come from unlikely places, from holes that you didn't consider when they catch sight of your dry. So finish your drifts. Here's something to consider in your presentation. If you have a natural pattern, say a pheasant tail in a smaller size, you could cast it 3 or 4 times in the same spot and not disturb the feeding fish. But if you're fishing a bigger pattern, let's say a squirmy or a streamer, bigger than the natural, you can put the fish off with just one bad drift. Speed is also your friend, the speed of the water. If you make a bad cast, it's best to let the current take it rather than try to manipulate it in the middle of the run you're trying to fish. There's all kinds of things floating in the river, and the trout are accustomed to objects being in the river. But if you give it an unnatural disturbance, that could put them down. If you haven't caught a fish on the swing, I highly recommend it. Swinging is a very effective way to cover water. You're positioning yourself upstream and you're making your casts and letting your fly drift down and then swing across. And you can effectively cover water with that method, taking a few steps down or a few steps across. And the swing is not a natural movement. It can tell you the attitude of the fish, and it gives them and you a different look. And that can make all the difference.